What if the story of Moses and the burning bush isn't a story about how brave Moses is, but it's actually a story about how God calls the reluctant, doubting people and uses their gifts for God's purpose? I'm Pastor Nate. This is another episode of the Sunday School Remix podcast. Today we're looking at the story of Moses being called by the burning bush. You can find it in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. Here we go. Welcome to the Sunday School Remix, the show where we take Bible stories you learned as a kid and look at them with fresh eyes. Each week, we dig into the context and the overlooked details, and we often discover interpretations we never heard growing up. This isn't about winning arguments, but simply hearing God's living word speak to our lives again today. So grab your Bible and put aside your assumptions, and let's dive into another episode of the Sunday School Remix. So, in Exodus chapter 3, we hear about Moses, who is tending the flocks of his uncle Jethro. And he is doing this when he discovers a burning bush. A bush that is burning and is not consumed by the fire. So a very strange oddity while he's out with his shepherd's staff taking care and guiding these sheep in the wilderness. A little backstory to this: part of the reason that Moses is here doing this work is because he had to flee from Egypt. He was taken in by Pharaoh's household. This is a crazy story. We got to go back even further. Moses was put in a little basket. You may remember that story. And he floats down the Nile River because the Pharaoh had decided to kill all Hebrew children under the age of 2. And so Moses' mother saves him by putting him in the basket, sending him down the river, and he is then raised, coincidentally, in Pharaoh's household. So Moses is this strange overlap of being a Hebrew, but being raised amongst the Egyptians and in places of power. And he accidentally sort of kind of kills someone because he starts standing up for the Hebrew people who are slaves at that time. He has some affinity towards them. And anyways, this is why he sort of flees and ends up in the wilderness. So he's there, he's tending sheep, and he sees a bush that's burning, but not being consumed by the fire. And then God starts to speak to Moses. And there's some cool things that God says, like take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. I love that imagery. I think that's really neat, and I like when we take off our shoes to acknowledge a holy place. I think there's something very poignant about that. I knew a woman who used to preach barefoot for this very reason. Like, she saw that act and her role as pastor and preaching as something very holy that she was doing, so she would take her shoes off before starting the sermon. I don't know, that's kind of fun, that's kind of cool. My feet smell too bad for me to do that. But then God and Moses have a conversation. And Moses is like, hey, what's your name? You know, like God's saying, I need you to go to Egypt to free the Israelites, to free the Hebrew people. And Moses is like, yeah, but like, what if I go and they ask who sent me? What should I say? And God says, I am who I am. What a non-answer answer. But also the theologians and philosophers have reflected on that phrase in so many different ways, because it's kind of God saying, I am existence itself. I am the ground of being. We could play around with that idea a lot if we wanted to. I think that there's so much to mine in that understanding. God's not some sort of static figure, an old man in the clouds with a big beard. No, what if we thought about God as existence itself, the very force that makes life possible? All right, see, now I sound like Star Wars. You see how this can go. But that statement, I am who I am, really kind of pushes us to stop asking questions that never have an answer. God, what's your name? It's like, God's like, I can't even explain that to you. Your fragile, tiny human mind can't fully figure out or comprehend the essence of who I am. So I am who I am. The other neat thing that I think I've talked about in videos before, in podcasts before, is the Hebrew word for this is Yahweh. And they've remarked that the name Yahweh sounds like human breathing. Yahweh, Yahweh. And that is really powerful as well. I am who I am. I am the ground of being itself. I am the sound of human breath, this respiratory process that keeps us alive. That is, in some way, speaking the name of God and connecting us with the Almighty. You can see how powerful the details of this story are for us and give us so much to reflect on from a faith perspective. And so Moses and God have this conversation, and after figuring out the name and all of that good stuff, I really want to get to chapter 4, because this is where the call of Moses really happens. God is saying to Moses, like, I need you to be the one to go to Egypt to free the Israelites. And here's what's neat about this too. The reason God says that God's speaking to Moses is because God has heard the suffering of my people. It is human suffering that gets God's attention and causes God to act. We often think and question, like, where is God during human suffering? And the story of the call of Moses tells us that human suffering is when God decides to start showing up. That God is attentive to that and constantly compassionate towards that. One of the things that I love about the entire Old Testament, and in particular the Jewish faith, is how it is grounded in this piece of the identity. God heard our suffering in Egypt, and that's how our covenant relationship began in a lot of ways. There was the covenant with Abraham before all of that, but the Torah, the law, the Ten Commandments, all those pieces that made the Israelites into the Jewish people, that gave them an identity and a connection with God, it's all rooted in the belief that God hears their suffering. And that's true for you too. Our faith is rooted in the belief that God hears and notices and has compassion for our suffering. That's the core of the entire promise. It's that God hears and understands your suffering and responds to it. The other beautiful thing about the way the story is written is that Moses walks toward the mystery. Moses sees this bush that's burning up but is not being consumed by the fire. And Moses walks towards it. The questions that we have, the doubts that we have, the mystery that's inherently connected to any sort of talk about the divine. We're invited and encouraged, I think, to walk towards those questions, to not just brush them off or push them aside, but to interrogate them, to wonder about them. That's what we see from Moses. What is this burning bush? And look where it led him. So in chapter 4, Moses asks, what if the people don't believe me? And Moses is kind of asking different versions of this question all throughout the conversation with the burning bush. His first question was what should I say that people call you, God, right? Who do I tell them sent me? I am who I am. And now at the beginning of chapter 4, Moses asks the same thing. He's what if people don't believe me that God called me to do this? Then what? And this is one of my favorite moments in Scripture. Moses asks that question. What if people don't believe me? And God doesn't answer directly. God asks Moses, what's in your hands? When we have doubts about whether or not God has called us, when we worry, what will people think about me stepping into a role like this? About me answering a call from God like this? When that happens, I think God tells us, hey, what's in your hands? What gifts do you have? What talents have I given you? Those pieces, sharing that part of who you are, will inherently help people know that you were sent by God. That's what God's saying to Moses. What is in your hand? But it gets even deeper than that. You see, because what's in Moses' hand is a staff. And that's what he tells guys. Okay, it's a staff. And then God gives him all these signs that Moses can do. It's all right, throw it on the ground and it becomes a snake. Whoa, all right. Now Moses is like, take your hand and put it in your cloak and pull it out. And look, it's going to have leprosy. Oh my gosh, like put it back in the cloak. And now pull it out again and then it's healed. So God gives Moses this like litany of magic tricks to do to convince the people that God has called Moses to this task. And that's all fun. Those make for good Sunday school lessons. But I think what's more important is that initial response from God. Hey, what's in your hands? And for you, yeah, you. Do you have doubts about what God might be calling you to do? Are you worried what people will think? Well, what's in your hand? Start with that question. What has God already given you that inherently proves that you're called to this work, whatever that might be? Furthermore on this, though, Moses continues to object. Even after the whole magic trick routine, Moses is like, yeah, like, but God, like, I'm not good at speaking. And God's like, okay, like, we'll get Aaron to come along. And Aaron, your cousin, he'll speak for you. And he can be the public voice, Moses, and you can be the behind-the-scenes leader. And then Moses just says in verse 13, like, oh God, please send someone else. Which is such a human reaction. And we think of Moses as this pillar of the faith and all these incredible things that he did. And that's true, but it starts with the fact that he was so reluctant. He had fled from Egypt because he was afraid. And then he makes 1,000 excuses when he talks with God at the burning bush. And God accommodates it, right? The other cool thing is that God never disagrees with Moses. God never says like, no, Moses, what are you talking about? Like, you're a great speaker. Like, clearly they knew. This guy's no good at this. But God is like, no, okay, I get it. Like, we'll send Aaron too. And it's a lesson for us too. Like, God will call us to all sorts of big and important roles, and there is inherently going to be questions that we have. We're going to doubt that that's the right direction to go, and God will provide. God's not going to tell us or call us to something that we're not equipped for. And there really could be good objections. Yeah, it would have helped if Moses was a good speaker. And God knew that Moses wasn't a good speaker. And so God sends Aaron along with it. But really, wrapping this up, at the very end, in verse 17, God circles back to the staff. It says like, hey, Moses, like, take your staff with you. What's in your hands? Like, don't forget that core piece that I've given you. And what's really beautiful is that Moses was holding the staff and he was out in the wilderness to witness this burning bush because he was a shepherd. And so God was calling Moses to shepherd the Israelite people out of slavery through the wilderness to the promised land. It's very similar to the call story we heard about the disciples, where God calls them and says like, hey, you fishermen, I will make you fishers of men. Hey, Moses, like, what's in your hands? You got a shepherd crook, right? Well, you're going to be a shepherd for the Israelite people because I heard they're suffering and I care about it. God works with what we have, with what's in our hands. That's where God shows up and is constantly calling us to find ways to use those gifts to alleviate the suffering of the people around us. Because we're all God's people. It's not just the Israelite people who are suffering. Many people are suffering in our world today. And God says to us, like, hey Nate, like, what's in your hands? How can you use the gifts that I've given to you and maybe reimagine them in a different way? Yeah, this is a shepherd's crook, and so this is caring for sheep. Like, okay, and you could play a shepherding role for the Israelites. Yeah, I'm a fisherman. I fish all day. Like, and you could fish for people. You see, again and again throughout the scriptures, this is what God does. Takes what we already have and helps us kind of expand, reimagine new ways to offer that gift for the sake of the world, to alleviate the suffering of all of God's people, because God cares about that. I'm Pastor Nate. This has been another episode of the Sunday School Remix. Hope you enjoyed it. Share it with family and friends, people who might need to hear this or just want a fun little Bible study tool in the midst of their summer break. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, remember, the story didn't end in Sunday school. Thanks for listening to another episode of Sunday School Remix. If you'd like more resources for your walk of faith, feel free to check out my church's website, bethany-denver.org, or you can download our mobile app by searching Bethany Connect in your phone's app store.